Someone get this man out of here before he ruins the entire night. The voice sliced through the ballroom like a blade, sharp, loud, deliberate, and it didn't just echo. It lingered, hanging in the air beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Regent Hotel, where champagne glasses paused mid-air and conversations collapsed into silence. All eyes turning toward the entrance where a man stood alone, unmoved, dressed in worn sneakers, a faded gray hoodie, and jeans that looked like they had seen too many long days. His presence clashing violently against the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, a visual disruption in a room built on perfection and status. And yet he didn't flinch, not when the host stepped forward with a tight smile masking irritation, not when security began inching closer, not even when a ripple of laughter quietly spread among a few guests who had already decided exactly who he was without asking a single question. Because Darius King had seen this before, not once, not twice, but enough times to recognize the pattern. Instantly, the narrowed eyes, the subtle distance, the unspoken agreement that someone like him didn't belong in a place like this. And still, he stood there calm, steady, as if the entire room was part of something only he understood, because it was, before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darius King, who slowly lifted his gaze across the ballroom, taking in every detail, the gold-trimmed walls, the polished marble floors, the waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of sparkling drinks, and the faces. Those faces that shifted between curiosity, judgment, and quiet dismissal, each one revealing more than they realized, because this wasn't just a gala, this was a test. And every person in that room was already answering without knowing it. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave," the head of security said, his tone controlled but firm, stepping closer as if proximity alone would enforce authority. But Darius didn't move, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply reached in his pocket and pulled out a black envelope, slightly creased but unmistakably real, handing it over without a word. The guard hesitated, glancing at the host, who gave a dismissive nod, as if to say it didn't matter, as if whatever was inside couldn't possibly change the narrative already written in their minds. And around them, whispers grew louder. A woman in a red dress leaned toward her friend, barely hiding a smirk. "This is exactly why they need stricter guest lists," she murmured, while a man near the bar chuckled under his breath. Guy probably wandered in off the street, and just a few feet away, someone had already pulled out their phone, capturing the moment not out of concern, but for entertainment, because to them, this wasn't injustice, it was spectacle. But then across the room, one person didn't laugh, didn't turn away, didn't pretend not to notice. Naomi Blake stood near the edge of the crowd, her brow furrowed, watching closely, not the clothes, not the assumptions, but the man himself, the way he stood, the way he didn't react, the way his silence seemed louder than everyone else's voices combined. And something about that didn't sit right with her, because while the room saw disruption, she saw control, and what no one else realized yet was that the night wasn't being ruined, it was being revealed. The guard's fingers hovered over the envelope like it might stain his reputation just by touch, his hesitation subtle but visible. And in that half-second pause, the room leaned in closer, drawn not by empathy, but by curiosity, the kind that feeds on discomfort. While the host exhaled sharply and stepped forward again, his patience thinning under the weight of eyes watching him lose control of his own event. "I said he needs to leave," he repeated, louder this time, not just for the man in front of him, but for the entire room, as if volume could reinforce authority. But Darius King remained exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, his silence no longer passive but deliberate, almost instructional, like he was allowing the moment to stretch just enough for everyone to reveal themselves fully. And they did, one by one. A woman near the center adjusted her diamond bracelet and turned her body away, as if proximity alone might lower her status. A man with a silver tie shook his head and muttered something about standards. Another guest laughed a little too loudly, eager to align himself with whatever side felt powerful, and yet none of them asked a question. None of them paused long enough to consider that they might be wrong, because judgment was faster, easier, safer when it flowed in the same direction as the crowd. Check the invitation. Naomi's voice cut in, not loud but clear, her words landing with enough weight to interrupt the rhythm of dismissal that had taken over the room. The guard glanced at her, surprised more by her tone than her presence, as if he had not expected anyone to step outside the invisible agreement forming around them. "Ma'am, this does not concern you," he replied quickly, but Naomi did not step back. She took one small step forward instead, her eyes shifting from the guard to Darius, studying him more carefully now. Not the clothes, not the surface, but the stillness, the kind of stillness that did not come from uncertainty, but from certainty so deep it did not need to announce itself. "It concerns everyone in this room," she said, and for a moment, just a moment, the air shifted, thin cracks forming in the confidence of those who had already made up their minds. The guard cleared his throat and finally opened the envelope, more out of pressure than intention, sliding the card halfway out before the host reached over and pressed it back down, his smile tight, controlled. "That is not necessary," he said, his voice dipping into something colder, something more careful now, because beneath the irritation there was a flicker of doubt he did not want to acknowledge, and Darius noticed it immediately, not reacting, not pushing, just watching, because this was the point where control always began to slip, not through confrontation, but through hesitation, and around them the whispers grew uneven, no longer unified, a few guests leaning closer, trying to catch a glimpse of what was being hidden, others shifting uncomfortably, as if the situation was no longer as entertaining as it had been seconds ago. Because uncertainty is heavier than certainty, and it settles differently in a room built on image. And still, Darius said nothing, because he did not need to. Every second of silence was doing more than words ever could, exposing not just how they saw him, but how quickly they chose to see without knowing. And across the room, Naomi did not look away, because now she understood. Something no one else did yet. This was not a man trying to get in. This was a man watching to see who deserved to stay. The host's hand lingered over the envelope a second too long, and that was all it took for the balance of the room to tilt just slightly, not enough for anyone to admit it, but enough for doubt to begin threading through the certainty that had filled the space moments before, and Darius King saw it clearly. The shift in posture, the tightening of smiles, the way confidence quietly recalibrated when it sensed it might be misplaced. "Open it," Naomi said again, her voice calm but firmer now, and this time it did not sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a correction, like she was restoring something that had already gone off track. And a few heads turned toward her, surprised that she had not stepped back, surprised that she had not followed the script everyone else had already accepted. The guard hesitated, eyes flicking between Naomi and the host, caught between protocol and pressure. And in that hesitation the room, filled with something heavier than before, not laughter, not judgment, but anticipation, because now the outcome was uncertain, and uncertainty demanded attention. "There is no need to create a scene," the host said quickly, his voice smoothing over the edges of tension. But it came a fraction too late. The moment had already moved past his control, and the guard, almost reflexively, slid the card out halfway again, just enough for a glimpse, not enough for clarity, but enough for curiosity to ignite. A few guests leaned in, trying to catch a name, a logo, anything that would either confirm their assumptions or force them to reconsider. And in that exact moment, a woman in a black gown stepped forward with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "Maybe he is just confused," she said lightly, directing her words toward Darius, as if he were a problem to be solved, not a person to be understood. "Sir, events like this can be overwhelming. Perhaps you wandered in by mistake." Her tone was gentle, practiced, the kind that disguises dismissal as kindness, and a man beside her nodded, adding with a soft chuckle, "Happens more than you think." And just like that, the room found a new script, one that allowed them to maintain their sense of superiority without appearing openly cruel, and several others followed, offering suggestions, directions, polite exits, each one reinforcing the same assumption in softer language. because sometimes exclusion does not shout, it smiles, and Darius listened to every word without interruption, his expression unchanged, his silence now functioning like a mirror, reflecting their intentions back at them without distortion. And then he moved, just slightly, not away, not toward the exit, but deeper into the room, a step that was small in distance but enormous in meaning, because it rejected every suggestion without confrontation, and that single step caused a ripple, subtle but undeniable. The guard straightened, unsure whether to follow or stop him. The host's jaw tightened, calculating his next move, and across the room Naomi watched more closely than anyone else. Because she recognized what others missed, this was not defiance born from ignorance. It was precision, and every reaction around him was being measured, cataloged, understood. And for the first time, a quiet realization began to settle in her mind. This night was not unfolding randomly. It was unfolding exactly as intended, and everyone in that room was already part of something they did not yet see. The shift was no longer subtle. It spread through the ballroom like a quiet current, changing the way people stood, the way they looked, the way they chose their next words. Because once doubt enters a room built on certainty, everything begins to feel unstable, and Darius King moved through it with deliberate ease, his steps unhurried, his presence no longer confined to the entrance, but now cutting through clusters of conversations that paused as he passed, some guests stepping back, instinctively as if distance alone could protect their assumptions, others leaning in with a different kind of interest now, curiosity replacing mockery, because the narrative they had accepted moments ago was no longer holding together as cleanly as before, and in that fragile space, new behaviors emerged. A man near the bar adjusted his jacket and forced a polite smile. "You know, sometimes these events get mixed up with outside vendors," he said, as if offering an explanation that would restore order, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty, and beside him a woman, with a perfectly rehearsed laugh, added, "Yes, maybe he is part of the staff," her tone light, dismissive, but not as confident as before, because now she was testing the idea rather than declaring it. And Darius stopped in front of them, not confronting, not correcting, just observing, his gaze steady enough to make their smiles falter, and in that silence they filled the space themselves, offering more words, more justifications, each one revealing less about him and more about them, because when people feel their assumptions slipping, they speak to hold them in place. And across the room, Naomi followed his movement, not physically, but with her attention, tracking the reactions like patterns unfolding in real time. She noticed how some guests softened their tone when he got closer, how others avoided eye contact entirely, how a few attempted politeness only when it felt safe, and it became clear to her that this was not random behavior. It was layered, predictable, almost like a test revealing different versions of the same bias. And then it happened again. A woman approached Darius directly, her smile warm, her posture open. "Hi," she said, extending her hand as if nothing had happened moments ago. "Are you enjoying the event?" Her voice carried a practiced charm, the kind designed to impress. But there was a delay, a fraction of a second too long, like she had adjusted her approach after sensing the shift in the room, and Darius looked at her hand, then back at her eyes, not accepting, not rejecting, simply holding the moment long enough for the truth to surface, and it did. Her smile tightened. Her confidence flickered, and she withdrew her hand with a quick laugh. "Well, it is a lovely night regardless," she added, stepping away just as quickly as she had arrived, because her interest was not in him, it was in what he might represent if the room decided he mattered. And when that certainty did not come, neither did she, and all around them, similar exchanges unfolded, subtle, quiet, but revealing, people testing their distance, their tone, their willingness to engage based on incomplete information, and Darius remained at the center of it, not as an outsider trying to enter, but as a constant forcing everyone else to reveal who they were when they thought no one important was watching. And near the edge of the room, Naomi took a slow breath, her initial curiosity now turning into clarity, because what she was witnessing was not just judgment. It was selection, and the unsettling part was realizing that most of the room had already failed without even realizing they were being measured. The room had settled into a strange rhythm now, no longer openly hostile but far from welcoming. A quiet recalibration of behavior as people adjusted their reactions in real time, trying to align themselves with whatever outcome felt safest. And in that shifting atmosphere, Darius King slowed his steps, pausing near a long table lined with untouched champagne glasses, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge without picking one up. His attention never fixed on the objects, but always on the people, because the real display was not the luxury, it was the reactions unfolding around him. And that was when Naomi moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that separated her from everyone else in the room. She picked up a glass of water instead of champagne, walked toward him without hesitation, and stopped just close enough to be seen but not intrusive. "You look like you could use this," she said simply, holding the glass out without expectation, her tone steady, free of performance. And for the first time that night, someone spoke to him without trying to define him first. Darius looked at the glass, then at her, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper now, more focused, as if something he had been waiting for had finally appeared, and he accepted it with a small nod, not exaggerated, not theatrical, just enough to acknowledge the gesture. And Naomi did not fill the silence that followed. She did not ask what he did not question why he was there, did not attempt to reposition herself based on the reactions of others. She simply stood there, present, and that presence carried a weight the room had not yet seen, because it was not influenced by status. It was anchored in something else entirely. "They're going to keep pushing," she said after a moment, her voice low but clear, her eyes briefly glancing toward the host and security who were still watching from a distance. "Recalculating. That tends to happen when people feel uncomfortable with what they do not understand." And Darius held her gaze for a second longer than he had with anyone else, not because she was different on the surface, but because her reaction had not shifted. Once since the beginning, and that consistency was rare, almost unfamiliar in a room built on adjustment and perception. "And you're not uncomfortable?" he asked, his voice calm, measured, the first time he had spoken since entering, and the sound of it seemed to cut through the surrounding noise in a way that drew attention without raising volume. Naomi shook her head slightly, a small, almost amused exhale escaping her. "No," she said, "because I am not trying to figure out where you belong. I am just noticing that you do." And the simplicity of that answer landed differently than anything else said that night. It did not challenge the room. It did not defend him. It simply refused to participate in the assumption. And around them, a few guests noticed the exchange, their expressions tightening as they tried to interpret what it meant, why she was engaging, whether it signaled something they had missed. Because now the question was no longer just about him. It was about whether they had misread the situation entirely. And that possibility made them uneasy, because being wrong in a room like this carried a cost, not financial, but social, reputational, and Darius saw that tension building again, the subtle shift in posture, the cautious glances, the way people began to pay attention not out of judgment, but out of self-preservation. And he took another slow sip of the water, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if marking the moment, because the test was no longer about entry, it was about response. And standing beside him, Naomi did not step back, did not reposition herself to align with the room. She stayed exactly where she was, and in doing so, she became the only person who had not changed once since the night began, and that, more than anything else, was what set her apart. The shift that had been building finally reached its edge, subtle tension hardening into something more deliberate as the host stepped forward again, this time without the polished smile, without the careful tone, his patience worn thin by the uncertainty spreading through his carefully curated event. "This has gone on long enough," he said, his voice firm and loud enough to pull every remaining conversation to a stop. And just like that, the room snapped back into alignment, attention redirected, eyes locking onto the center where Darius and Naomi stood, no longer just observers, but now the focal point of a situation the host was determined to control. "Sir, I am asking you one last time to leave," he continued, his words no longer wrapped in politeness, but edged with authority. And beside him, the head of security took a step closer, not aggressive, but intentional, reinforcing the command without needing to say it again, and around them the guests shifted, some stepping back to create distance, others leaning in to witness what felt like the inevitable conclusion, because in their minds the outcome had already been decided. It was just a matter of time before it played out, but Darius did not move, not a single inch, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if the rising pressure around him did not belong to him at all, as if it were something he was simply observing rather than experiencing. And Naomi felt it too, the tightening of the space, the quiet expectation that she would step away now, separate herself before the situation escalated further. But she did not. She remained exactly where she was, her presence no longer passive but quietly firm, and that decision did not go unnoticed. The host's eyes flicked toward her briefly, irritation flashing across his face. "Ma'am, I suggest you step aside," he said sharply, and for a moment the room held its breath, waiting to see if she would comply, waiting to see if the pattern would repeat itself once again. But Naomi shook her head slightly, not defiant, not dramatic, just certain. "He has not done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady, and that single sentence landed heavier than anything else spoken that night, because it challenged not just the action, but the assumption behind it, and the host's composure cracked just enough to reveal frustration beneath the surface. "This is a private event," he replied quickly, "and we reserve the right to maintain the standard of our guests." And there it was, the truth dressed in formal language, the justification that had been guiding every decision from the start, and Darius heard it clearly, every word confirming exactly what he had already seen, and slowly, deliberately, he set the empty glass of water down on the nearest table, the soft sound of it touching the surface, cutting through the silence like a signal. And for the first time since entering the room, he moved with intention that was not observational but decisive, reaching into his pocket once more, pulling out his phone, his movements unhurried, precise, as if every second was measured. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried across the room with unmistakable clarity. "Call my office," he said, not looking at anyone in particular, as if the instruction existed beyond the room itself. "Tell them to begin protocol, Crown." And the words meant nothing to most of the people present, just another strange statement from a man they had already dismissed. But to a few, to those paying closer attention, something about the way he said it did not fit the narrative they had built. It did not sound like a bluff. It did not sound like desperation. It sounded like confirmation, and in that moment, the room did not erupt. It did not react loudly. Instead, it paused, suspended between disbelief and realization, because something had just shifted again, and this time it was not subtle. For a moment, nothing happened. And that was the most unsettling part, because the room had expected a reaction, a raised voice, a confrontation, something that fit the version of the man they had already constructed in their minds. But instead, there was only silence, heavy and deliberate, stretching across the ballroom, as if time itself had slowed to watch what would come next. And then it began, not with a shout, not with a scene, but with a sound so subtle most people almost missed it, a soft chime echoing from the large digital display mounted above the stage, the same screen that had been cycling through sponsor names and event highlights all evening, except now it flickered once, twice, before going completely black, and the sudden absence of light pulled every gaze upward, conversations cutting off mid-sentence, glasses lowering slowly as attention shifted away from the man they had been judging to the system they had trusted. And then the screen came back on, but not as it had been before, the elegant slideshow replaced by a single, stark image, a corporate logo that did not belong to the event branding, bold, unmistakable, and beneath it a name appeared in clean white letters, Darius King, followed by a title that seemed to land like a weight on the entire room, founder and majority stakeholder. And for a second no one reacted, because the mind resists what it cannot immediately reconcile, and this did not match anything they had assumed, anything they had said, anything they had believed just moments ago. And then the realization began to spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, visible shifts. A woman near the front covered her mouth, a man by the bar straightened abruptly, his earlier confidence dissolving into something far less certain. The Host's expression froze, his posture stiffening as the words on the screen replayed in his mind faster than he could process them. And beside him, the head of security took a half step back, instinctively creating distance from a situation that no longer belonged to him, because authority had just changed hands without a single argument. And Darius did not move. He did not gesture toward the screen, did not confirm or deny. He simply stood there as the room caught up to a truth he had never needed to announce. And Naomi felt it before she fully understood it. The shift in energy, the collapse of assumption, the quiet unraveling of everything that had been projected onto him since he walked in. And when she looked at him now, it was not with surprise, but with clarity, because the way he had carried himself, the way he had observed, the way he had never once reacted out of place, it all aligned now in a way that made the entire night feel intentional, designed. And across the ballroom, whispers began to rise again. But they were different now, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but urgent, uncertain. "Is that real?" someone asked under their breath. "It has to be," another replied, already pulling out a phone, searching, verifying, because doubt had flipped direction, and now it was aimed at themselves. And the host finally found his voice, but when he spoke, it was no longer sharp, no longer commanding. It was careful, almost cautious. "Mr. King," he began, the name unfamiliar in his mouth despite having seen it seconds ago. And that single change said everything, because moments earlier he had not needed a name to dismiss him, and now he could not speak without it. And Darius turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the voice, his expression unchanged, his calm intact, but his presence now carried a weight the room could no longer ignore, because the man they had tried to remove had just become the one person they could not afford to offend. And in that silence that followed, the gala was no longer an event. It was a revelation unfolding in real time. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, piece by piece, as the weight of the truth settled unevenly across the room. And with it came something far more uncomfortable than embarrassment: accountability. Because now every word spoken, every glance exchanged, every assumption made just minutes earlier stood exposed without defense. And the host felt it first. The shift from authority to uncertainty pressing against him like a tightening collar, his posture adjusting, his voice softening as he took a cautious step forward. "Mr. King, I was not aware," he began, each word chosen carefully, deliberately, as if precision alone could undo what had already been revealed. But Darius did not respond immediately. He let the apology hang in the air unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because it was not meant for him. It was meant for the room, for the witnesses, for the preservation of image rather than the correction of behavior. And that difference mattered. "You were not supposed to be aware," Darius said finally, his tone even, controlled, but unmistakably firm, and the simplicity of that sentence cut deeper than any accusation could have, because it removed the excuse before it could fully form. It clarified that the problem was not ignorance. It was instinct, and around them the guests began to shift again. But this time there was no cohesion, no unified reaction to follow. Some stepped back entirely, distancing themselves from the moment, as if it had nothing to do with them. Others leaned forward, eager to repair what they had misjudged, offering smiles, nods, subtle acknowledgments that felt more like negotiation than sincerity, and a few simply stood frozen, caught between what they had shown and what they now wished they had been. And Darius saw all of it, not reacting to any single person, but absorbing the collective response, because this was the outcome he had come for. Not the reveal itself, but what followed it, the unfiltered reaction when status replaced assumption. And beside him, Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just thoughtful, as if the revelation confirmed something she had already understood rather than introducing something new. And that steadiness did not go unnoticed. Darius glanced at her briefly, a small acknowledgement passing between them without words, because in a room full of shifting behavior, consistency had become the rarest trait, and the host, still trying to regain control of a situation that no longer belonged to him, cleared his throat, attempting to redirect attention. "We would be honored if you joined us." On stage, he said, gesturing toward the center platform as if extending an invitation rather than correcting a mistake, but the offer hung awkwardly in the air, its timing exposing its intention, and Darius did not move toward it. Instead, he took a slow step forward into the open space of the ballroom, his presence now commanding attention without effort, not because of the screen, not because of the title, but because of everything that had just unfolded. And when he spoke again, his voice carried across the room with quiet authority. "You did not reject a stranger tonight," he said, his gaze moving across the faces in front of him. Not accusing, not angry, just clear. "You revealed how quickly you decide who deserves to be seen." And the words settled heavily, not shouted, not dramatic, but undeniable, because they did not target one person. They reflected the entire room, and no one could step outside of that reflection. And in that moment, the gala was no longer about status, or image, or influence. It was about truth, laid bare in a way that no one present could ignore, and the cost of that truth was not something that could be undone with a simple apology or a polite invitation. It was something that would stay with them long after the night ended. The room did not recover. It adjusted, slowly, unevenly, like a structure forced to stand after its foundation had shifted, and Darius King stood at the center of it without moving, without needing to, because the weight of the moment no longer required action. It required reflection, and that was something no one in the room could escape now. Not the host who had already stepped back half a pace without realizing it. Not the guests who had begun lowering their eyes instead of raising their glasses. Not even the ones attempting quiet smiles as if politeness could rewrite what had already been revealed, because the truth had settled too deeply, and it was not loud, it was not chaotic, it was quiet, heavy, and permanent. "This was never about the gala," Darius said, his voice steady, measured, carrying across the room with a calm authority that no longer needed confirmation. "It was about what happens when no one thinks they are being watched," and the words did not accuse. They clarified. They placed the responsibility exactly where it belonged, not on a moment, but on a mindset. And around him the room absorbed it in silence, because there was no immediate response that could counter something so precise. And slowly, deliberately, Darius turned his attention to Naomi, not dramatically, not to display anything to the room, but simply because she was the only person who had not required the reveal to remain consistent. "You did not change," he said, his tone quieter now, but no less clear, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, without surprise, just understanding. "There was nothing to change," she replied, and that answer, simple as it was, carried more weight than any apology offered that night, because it did not depend on status. It did not adjust to circumstance. It existed before the truth was revealed and remained after it. And that was the difference. Darius gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not ceremonial, just acknowledgement. And then he looked back at the room one final time, not scanning for reactions, not measuring outcomes anymore, just observing what remained after everything unnecessary had fallen away. "Respect is not something you offer when it is convenient," he said, his voice steady, each word landing with quiet precision. "It is something you either carry or you do not." And the statement settled over the room like a final line that needed no follow-up, because it was not meant to be debated. It was meant to be remembered. And with that, Darius stepped back, not toward the stage, not toward the center of attention, but away from it, his presence no longer needing the space it had occupied, because what mattered had already been done. And as he moved, the crowd did not part out of authority. It parted out of recognition, subtle, unspoken, but real, and Naomi walked beside him without hesitation, not following, not leading, simply aligned, and behind them the gala remained, but it was no longer the same. The music that had once filled the room now felt distant. The conversation slower, more careful, as if everyone present was recalibrating not just their words, but their awareness, and no announcement was made, no dramatic exit declared, because none was needed. The impact had already been delivered in the only way that mattered, quietly, completely. And as the doors closed behind them, the room was left with something far more valuable than status or image. It was left with a standard that had just been raised without a single shout, without a single demand. only through truth revealed and dignity maintained.